Ghastly Garlic Episode 34. The Shadows Among Us. 6 Haunting Encounters with the Shadows. Part 1. The Shadow on the Sidewalk. Happened in Ohio, United States. The night was serene, the moon casting an eerie glow over the quiet neighborhood in Ohio. Olivia, her mom, and her stepdad, David, returned from a pleasant day out. They were laughing as they walked up the steps to their modest 2-story house. The air was cool, and the only sounds were the distant chirping of crickets and the soft rustling of leaves. As they reached the front door, Olivia's mom fumbled through her purse for the house key. Feeling restless, Olivia wandered around the porch, her eyes scanning the surroundings. Suddenly, something caught her eye. She glanced up and saw a shadow standing on the sidewalk in front of their house. It was the outline of a man, tall and featureless, blending into the night. Olivia froze, her breath caught in her throat. The shadow seemed to sense her gaze, and, in an unsettlingly smooth motion, glided down the sidewalk and disappeared between the houses. It moved with an eerie, fluid grace, not quite walking, not quite floating. "Did you see that?" Olivia whispered, her voice trembling. David, who had been standing behind her, nodded slowly. "Yeah, I saw it too." "What was that?" Both of them stared at the spot where the shadow had vanished, their minds racing to make sense of what they had just witnessed. It wasn't the first time Olivia had experienced something unexplainable, but this was different. The shadow was so real, so tangible, yet utterly inexplicable. Inside the house, the atmosphere was tense. Olivia and David recounted the incident to her mom, who listened with a mixture of skepticism and concern. Despite their shared experience, Olivia couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this shadow than met the eye. It hadn't felt threatening, but its presence lingered in her mind, a mystery waiting to be unraveled. Over the next few days, Olivia couldn't stop thinking about the shadow. She began researching shadow figures, delving into forums and reading about other people's encounters. The stories varied, but one thing was clear: shadow figures were often associated with paranormal activity. Some believed they were spirits, while others thought they were manifestations of something darker. One evening, Olivia decided to investigate further. She had always been sensitive to the supernatural, experiencing strange occurrences throughout her life. This time, she was determined to find out what the shadow wanted. Armed with a flashlight, she ventured outside to the spot where they had seen the shadow. The neighborhood was quiet, the houses dark and silent. Olivia's footsteps echoed softly on the pavement as she approached the sidewalk. She stood there, her flashlight cutting through the darkness, and waited. Minutes passed, the stillness of the night pressing in on her. Just as she was about to give up, she felt a chill run down her spine. There it was again. The shadow. It stood a few feet away, its form indistinct yet unmistakable. Olivia's heart pounded in her chest, but she forced herself to stay calm. She took a deep breath and stepped closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "Who are you? What do you want?" The shadow didn't respond, but Olivia felt a strange sensation, as if it was trying to communicate with her. She closed her eyes, focusing on the feeling. Images flashed through her mind: a man in despair, a tragic accident, a plea for help. The emotions were overwhelming, a torrent of sorrow and pain that left her breathless. When she opened her eyes, the shadow was gone. Olivia staggered back, her mind reeling from the experience. She knew now that the shadow wasn't just a figment of her imagination. It was a lost soul, trapped between worlds, seeking closure. Determined to understand more, Olivia began digging into the history of her neighborhood. She visited the local library, combing through old newspapers and records. It was a painstaking process, but eventually, she found hints of what she was looking for. Decades ago, a man had died in a tragic accident near the very spot where she had seen the shadow. His death had been sudden and violent, leaving his spirit restless. Olivia felt a deep sense of empathy for the man. She knew she had to do something. But what? How could she help a spirit find peace? She couldn't shake the feeling that there was something she was missing, something important that she needed to uncover. As she stood on the porch that night, staring into the darkness, she wondered, was this just the beginning? How many other restless spirits were out there, waiting for someone to help them? And why did she feel so connected to this shadow? What was it trying to tell her? The questions swirled in her mind, and Olivia knew that her journey was far from over. There were more shadows out there, more mysteries to unravel, and she was determined to find the answers. But where would this path lead her? And what other secrets lay hidden in the shadows? End of Part 1. Part 2, The Haunting in the Hallway, happened in Maine, United States. It had been weeks since Mark last saw the figure in his hallway, but last night it returned, bringing with it a sense of unease that he couldn't shake. The man, the shadowy figure, was back, and this time, it was different. Mark was starting to believe that his hallway was haunted. It seemed absurd, but the incidents were becoming impossible to ignore. That evening, around 4 p.m., Mark had gone to the bathroom. As he passed the stairs, the light from a downstairs window cast shadows up the steps. For a brief moment, he saw a shadow like someone was coming up, but when he looked again, no one was there. By the time he came out of the bathroom, the shadow had vanished, and the house was silent. When night fell, Mark tried to carry on with his usual routine. He read a book in bed, using the moonlight and a faint glow from an outside light to see the pages. He'd been doing this for years, despite knowing it wasn't great for his eyes. As he read, the outside light suddenly dimmed. It didn't go out completely, it just lost most of its brightness. The power in the house was still on. He could see the distant streetlights and hear the muted sound of his dad's TV downstairs. Moments later, the light outside flickered back to full strength. That's when Mark saw it. A shadow that looked like a man standing just outside his door. He blinked, and it was gone. Several times, he saw a head peek into his room, just as he had seen before. But this time, there was something else. A white shape at the foot of his bed, outside his door. It hovered there, always just out of full view. Mark felt a sensation on his foot, like something lifting off the blanket, but when he checked, there was nothing there. For the first time, he felt genuinely afraid. A cold chill ran through him, and he got goosebumps. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming, pressing down on him like a physical weight. He tried to confront the presence. "Go away," he shouted, stomping his foot against the bed. "You don't belong here." But the disturbances didn't stop. The shadowy man reappeared. The white shape at the end of his bed continued to try to peek over, and he felt a cold, eerie presence in his room. When Mark finally worked up the courage to get out of bed and use the bathroom, he avoided looking down the hallway. On his way back, he couldn't help but glance at the corner, where the darkness seemed thicker than usual. It felt wrong, like it was swallowing the light. Stuff kept happening, but Mark's memory blurred after that point. He must have fallen asleep out of sheer exhaustion. What was happening in his house? Why was this shadowy man haunting him? The figure didn't seem to listen to his commands. It felt like it was trying to torment him, yet he wasn't having nightmares, just this persistent, unsettling series of events. Mark dreaded the possibility of waking up with sleep paralysis, a fear he hadn't faced before but couldn't shake now. Should he tell his dad? What if his dad didn't believe him? Mark's mind raced with questions, seeking answers and finding none. What did the shadow want? Why his house? Why him? The story of the figure in the hallway left Mark more confused and frightened than ever. The sense of unease lingered, making every shadow seem threatening. As he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, he knew this wasn't the end. There had to be more to this haunting. What was he missing? And how could he stop it before it drove him mad? End of Part 2. Part 3, The Shadow in the Hall, happened in California, United States. When Rachel was 12, she lived in an old house in Maine. Now, at 22, she still remembered the strange occurrences that happened there. She never believed in ghosts until she experienced something that defied explanation. The house had 3 bedrooms, and Rachel shared hers with her baby sister. Her parents and brother had their own rooms. Every night, everyone would close their doors except for Rachel. She preferred her door open, though she couldn't explain why. The hallway outside her room was long and dark, creating an eerie atmosphere. Rachel often stayed up late watching TV, while everyone else slept. One night, as she watched her favorite show, she noticed a tall, shadowy figure peeking into her room. Each time she turned to look, it would retreat, disappearing from view. Oddly, Rachel didn't feel afraid, just curious. She continued watching TV, and the figure continued its game of hide and seek until she fell asleep. On another evening, Rachel was in the kitchen making eggs. From there, she could see the hallway through an open bar area that connected to the living room. As she cooked, she saw the shadowy figure again, peeking out from the hallway. Whenever she turned to look directly at it, it vanished, only to reappear when she looked away. It was unsettling, but still, Rachel felt more puzzled than scared. Then came the night that changed everything. Everyone was asleep except for Rachel's brother, who had his girlfriend over. Their door was slightly ajar, and the light from their room spilled into Rachel's. Rachel had fallen asleep when something woke her. She opened her eyes to see a clear image of a man in her room, staring intently into the hallway. He didn't notice her at first, seeming more concerned with whatever he was hiding from. He looked worried and scared, and Rachel felt paralyzed with shock. The man was Caucasian, and he seemed almost solid compared to the shadowy figure she had seen before. Rachel was frozen, unable to move or scream. Eventually, she managed to turn on her lamp. The man turned to look at her, and then, slowly, he vanished. Terrified, Rachel slept with her lamp on for the rest of the night. They eventually moved out of the house, but the memories of that man and the shadowy figure haunted Rachel. Who was he? What was he hiding from? Why did he seem so afraid? And why did these encounters never leave her feeling truly frightened, only deeply unsettled? Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story, something she had yet to understand. The shadowy figure and the worried man remained a mystery, one that continued to gnaw at her curiosity and fear. As she lay awake in her new room, she couldn't help but wonder if they were still out there, watching and waiting. And if they were, what did they want from her? The unanswered questions lingered in Rachel's mind, drawing her deeper into the mystery. What secrets did the old house hold? And would she ever uncover the truth about the shadow in the hall? End of Part 3. Part 4, The Return of the Shadow Man, happened in Washington, United States. Evan had always been haunted by memories of the Shadow Man, a figure that lurked in the corners of his childhood, instilling fear and anger. Growing up in Washington, he thought he had left those days behind. For years, there were no sightings, and his anger issues, which he believed were tied to the presence of the Shadow Man, subsided. He lived a relatively normal life, until recently. It started about a month ago. Evan worked at a fast food joint and rarely took the late shifts. One evening, around 8 p.m., he felt an intense discomfort. It was dark outside, and the dining room walls, made almost entirely of windows, exposed him to the night. He felt watched, as if eyes were peering at him from the darkness. He couldn't shake the feeling, even though he tried to convince himself it was just paranoia. When he went outside to throw out the garbage, the sensation intensified. He hurried back inside, unnerved. 2 weeks later, Evan was on the morning shift before the store opened. As he prepared for the day, he saw a black figure walking around the dining room. He knew it was the Shadow Man. This time, he got a better look at it than ever before. It was unmistakable. His heart raced, and he felt a cold dread settle over him. When he went to check, the figure was gone. He tried to rationalize it, blaming his imagination, but the fear lingered. Then, his mother mentioned something that sent chills down his spine. She had woken up in the middle of the night to see a black figure standing near her bed, looking down at her. Her description matched the Shadow Man perfectly. This was no coincidence. The Shadow Man was back, and it seemed more real than ever. Evan's temper flared more frequently. He felt annoyed, angry, bitter, and hateful. It reminded him of his childhood, when the Shadow Man seemed to amplify his anger. Now, as an adult, he struggled to maintain his composure. He felt disconnected from his emotions, indifferent to human life. The part of him that tried to be nice and care for people felt like it was slipping away. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing from his soul, as if the Shadow Man had taken a piece of him long ago, and now sought to reclaim more. Evan was scared, not just of the figure, but of losing himself. He had to find a way to rid his life of this presence, but he didn't know how. The Shadow Man seemed tied to his very essence, feeding off his fear and anger. Desperate, Evan scoured the internet for answers, finding solace in online communities that discussed paranormal experiences. He shared his story, hoping for guidance, but the responses were mixed. Some suggested cleansing rituals, others advised ignoring the entity, and a few warned that confronting it could make things worse. Evan decided to confront the Shadow Man. He couldn't live in fear, and he couldn't let this entity consume him. That night, he waited in his darkened room, determined to face the figure. Hours passed, and just as he began to doubt his plan, he felt a presence. The air grew cold, and a shadowy form materialized at the foot of his bed. "Why are you here?" Evan demanded, his voice shaking. The shadow man didn't respond. It stood silently, its dark form blending with the shadows. Evan's anger flared. "Leave me alone," he shouted, but the figure remained, unmoving, its presence oppressive. Evan felt a surge of rage and despair. He was losing control, his emotions spiraling. The shadow man seemed to feed on his turmoil, growing darker and more defined. Evan's vision blurred, and he felt himself slipping into a state of uncontrollable anger and fear. In a final act of desperation, Evan grabbed a mirror from his bedside table and thrust it towards the shadow man. The figure recoiled, and for a brief moment, Evan saw his own reflection within the shadow. It was his face, twisted with rage and fear, staring back at him. Then, the shadow man vanished. Evan collapsed onto his bed, exhausted. The house was silent, but the sense of dread lingered. He knew this wasn't over. The shadow man was a part of him, a manifestation of his deepest fears and anger. He had confronted it, but the battle was far from won. In the days that followed, Evan felt a strange mix of relief and apprehension. The shadow man hadn't appeared again, but the darkness inside him was still there. He had glimpsed the connection between them, and it left him with more questions than answers. What was the shadow man? Why had it chosen him? And how could he truly be free of it? Evan's journey was just beginning. The shadow man was gone, but the fear and anger remained. He had to find a way to understand and conquer the darkness within him. The answers were out there, waiting to be discovered, but the path was shrouded in mystery and danger. He couldn't escape his past, but he could fight for his future. As Evan stared into the night, he felt the weight of his unresolved questions. The shadow man had left him with more than fear. It had left him with a quest for understanding. And he knew, deep down, that this was only the beginning. The shadow man would return, and when it did, Evan would be ready. End of Part 4. Part 5, The Phantom of the Compound, happened in Saudi Arabia. Fayad had always been skeptical of the supernatural. Born and raised in Saudi Arabia, he had grown up hearing tales of jinn and spirits, but he never truly believed them. That was until his family moved to a new house in a compound near the airport, a place where his reality was about to be shaken. One night, around midnight, Fayad and his younger brother, Tariq, were up late watching TV. The rest of the family was asleep, and they decided to cook some fries. Fayad was in the kitchen, focused on the fryer, while Tariq went to the bathroom. As Fayad walked through the dimly lit corridor, he caught a glimpse of something in the living room out of the corner of his eye. A man, or what appeared to be a man, was sitting on the sofa. Startled, he turned quickly, but the room was empty. He shook his head, dismissing it as a trick of his mind. A few days later, after completing his evening prayers, Fayad placed the Quran on the table. He saw it again, a shadowy figure standing in the corner of the room. This time, it was more distinct, almost solid. He turned to face it, but it vanished. His heart raced as he tried to rationalize what he had seen. Could it be his imagination? The most unsettling encounter happened when Fayad, his mother, and his eldest brother, Amir, were watching TV. In the middle of a video, the screen blacked out for a second. During that brief moment, Fayad saw a boy, shrouded in darkness, standing just a step away. When the screen came back on, the boy was gone. He looked around, but there was no one there. Fayad's parents dismissed his experiences, attributing them to overactive imagination. But Fayad knew what he had seen. He began to research, diving into folklore and urban legends, trying to find answers. The more he read, the more he realized that these encounters were not mere figments of his imagination. There was something, or someone, haunting their new home. Determined to uncover the truth, Fayad set up cameras around the house. He spent hours reviewing the footage, but found nothing unusual. Frustrated yet undeterred, he continued his nightly vigil, hoping to capture evidence of the entity that eluded him. One night, as Fayad lay in bed, he felt a sudden chill. The air grew heavy, and a sense of foreboding enveloped him. He heard a faint whisper, unintelligible yet undeniably real. His eyes darted around the room, searching for the source. In the dim light, he saw it. A shadowy figure standing at the foot of his bed. It was the boy, his form dark and indistinct, but his presence palpable. Fahad's breath caught in his throat. He wanted to scream, but fear paralyzed him. The boy's figure seemed to flicker, growing more substantial before fading into the darkness. When Fahad finally found the courage to move, he bolted out of his room, his heart pounding. The next morning, Fahad shared his latest experience with his family. His parents were concerned but still skeptical. Amir, however, began to take him seriously. Together, they decided to investigate the history of the house and the compound. They discovered that the compound was built on land that had once been the site of an ancient village, long abandoned and shrouded in mystery. Rumors spoke of a tragic event that had befallen the villagers, leaving many restless spirits behind. Among these tales was the story of a young boy who had disappeared under mysterious circumstances. His body was never found, and it was said that his spirit still wandered the area, searching for peace. Fahad and Amir knew they had to do something to help the boy's spirit find rest. They sought the advice of a local elder, a man well versed in the old traditions and knowledgeable about the supernatural. He advised them to perform a ritual to communicate with the spirit and help guide it to the afterlife. That night, under the elder's guidance, Fahad and Amir performed the ritual. They lit candles and recited prayers, calling out to the boy's spirit. As they did, the air grew colder, and the candles flickered. The boy appeared, his form more distinct than ever. Fahad felt a wave of sadness emanating from the spirit, a longing for peace. With trembling hands, Fahad spoke to the boy, promising to help him find rest. The boy's expression softened, and he slowly faded from view. The room grew warmer, and the oppressive atmosphere lifted. Fahad and Amir felt a sense of relief, believing they had succeeded. However, the next few days proved them wrong. The sightings continued, more frequent and intense. The boy's spirit seemed agitated, almost angry. Objects began to move on their own, and strange noises echoed through the house at night. It became clear that their efforts had only disturbed the spirit further. Desperate, Fahad and Amir consulted the elder again. He told them that the boy's spirit was bound to the land by a powerful force, something dark and ancient. To truly free the boy, they needed to find and destroy the source of this power. The search led them to an old, crumbling well hidden in the back of the compound. Legend had it that the well was cursed, a gateway to the underworld. Many believed that the boy had fallen into the well, his soul trapped within its depths. Fahad and Amir knew what they had to do. With the elder's help, they prepared to destroy the well and release the boy's spirit. It was a dangerous task, but they were determined to see it through. On a moonless night, they gathered around the well, armed with holy water and ancient incantations. As they began the ritual, the ground trembled, and a dark mist rose from the well. The boy's spirit appeared, his face twisted in fear and pain. The air grew thick with malevolent energy, and the shadows seemed to come alive. Fahad and Amir pressed on, chanting the incantations and sprinkling holy water into the well. The mist writhed and hissed, but they didn't falter. The boy's spirit reached out, his expression pleading. With one final, powerful chant, they shattered the well's curse. The mist dissipated, and the boy's spirit began to glow with a soft, ethereal light. He smiled, a look of peace and gratitude on his face. Slowly, he faded away, his soul finally free. Fahad and Amir stood in silence, the weight of the moment sinking in. They had done it, they had freed the boy's spirit. But as they walked back to the house, they couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching them. The house was quiet, the oppressive atmosphere gone, but a lingering sense of unease remained. Fahad couldn't escape the feeling that their actions had awakened something else, something darker. He knew their journey was far from over. The Shadow Man was gone, but the darkness that haunted their home was still there, waiting. And so, the mystery deepened. The questions lingered. What other secrets did the land hold? What had they truly unleashed? As Fahad stared into the night, he knew one thing for certain: this was just the beginning. The true horror was yet to come, and he would be ready. End of Part 5. Part 6, The Black Shadow Man, happened in Canada. Katie had always felt a sense of unease in her family home. Even before her recent experience, there had been whispers of strange occurrences and eerie feelings. But it wasn't until 2 nights ago that her fears became undeniable. Her parents had gone out for the evening, leaving Katie to look after her little brother, Jamie. To keep herself company, she invited her boyfriend, Ryan, over. They settled in to watch a DVD, with Jamie fast asleep in his room on the second floor. The evening was peaceful, a rare tranquility enveloping the house. That tranquility was shattered by Jamie's scream. Katie and Ryan raced upstairs, their hearts pounding. They found Jamie sitting upright in bed, shaking, his eyes wide with terror. He pointed to a corner of the room, his voice quivering as he said, "That black man there." Katie and Ryan turned on the lights, but there was nothing in the corner. Ryan laughed it off, attributing it to a nightmare. Katie tried to comfort Jamie, but he remained inconsolable, begging her to take down a shirt from his wall. It was his favorite shirt, one he never let anyone touch. He insisted, "The black man doesn't want me to have it." Katie hesitated, confused by her brother's fear, but she remembered her own childhood and her mother's reaction when she recounted the incident the next day. Her mother was startled, revealing that Katie herself had seen the same black figure as a toddler. Katie had no memory of it, but her mother recounted how she would often cry in the night, pointing to a corner of her room, talking about a tall, black man. What chilled Katie to the bone was the realization that this wasn't confined to their current house. They had lived in a different house back in Salmon Arm, and she had seen the black figure there as well. Now, living on an island far from their old home, Jamie was seeing the same figure. It wasn't the house. It was something connected to them. Katie spent the next few days in a state of heightened alert. She tried to rationalize the events, but the fear gnawed at her. She started researching, diving into folklore and urban legends, hoping to find an explanation. She discovered that sightings of shadowy figures, often referred to as shadow people, were a common phenomenon across different cultures. Some believed these entities were malevolent spirits, while others thought they were interdimensional beings. The more Katie read, the more questions she had. Why were she and Jamie being targeted? Was it something about their family? A curse? A haunting? She couldn't find any definitive answers, but the stories she read all shared one common thread. The shadow people thrived on fear. Determined to protect her brother, Katie decided to confront the entity. That night, she stayed awake, her senses on high alert. The house was silent, the only sound the ticking of the clock. Hours passed, and just as she was about to give into exhaustion, she felt it. A sudden chill, a shift in the air. She looked towards the corner of her room, and there it was. The black shadow man. Tall, dark, and indistinct, it seemed to absorb the light around it. Katie's heart raced, but she forced herself to stay calm. "What do you want?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The figure didn't move or respond. It just stood there, an ominous presence. Katie felt a wave of anger and fear, memories of her childhood terror flooding back. She stepped towards the figure, her resolve hardening. "Leave us alone," she said, louder this time. "You have no power over us." The figure seemed to waver, its form flickering. Katie felt a surge of hope. Maybe she could drive it away. She continued to speak, her voice gaining strength. "You don't belong here. Go back to where you came from." The shadow man started to fade, its edges blurring. Katie kept talking, her fear giving way to determination. But just as the figure was about to disappear completely, it surged forward, enveloping her in darkness. Katie screamed, the sound echoing through the house. She felt a cold, crushing weight pressing down on her, her vision going black. In her mind, she heard a voice, low and sinister. "You cannot escape me. I am part of you." When Katie woke up, it was morning. She was lying on the floor, her body aching. Jamie and Ryan were beside her, their faces pale with worry. "What happened?" Ryan asked, helping her to sit up. Katie shook her head, the memories of the night before flooding back. "The shadow man," she said, her voice hoarse. "He's still here." Over the next few days, the activity in the house escalated. Jamie continued to see the shadow man, and now Katie did too. Objects moved on their own, strange noises echoed through the halls, and an oppressive atmosphere settled over the house. Katie's parents, initially skeptical, began to experience the phenomena as well. Desperate for answers, Katie reached out to a local paranormal investigator. The investigator conducted a thorough examination of the house, using various tools and techniques. He confirmed what Katie had feared. The shadow man was a malevolent entity, attached to their family. Its origins were unclear, but its intentions were undoubtedly sinister. The investigator advised them to perform a cleansing ritual, but warned that it might not be enough to completely banish the entity. Katie and her family gathered the necessary materials and performed the ritual, reciting prayers and burning sage. For a while, it seemed to work. The house felt lighter, the oppressive atmosphere lifted, but it didn't last. The Shadow Man returned, angrier than before. It became more aggressive, appearing more frequently and causing more disturbances. Katie felt a growing sense of dread, a feeling that they were running out of time. One night, Katie had a vivid dream. She saw herself as a child, standing in her old room in Salmon Arm. The Shadow Man was there, looming over her. In the dream, she felt the same fear and helplessness she had as a child. But then, she saw something she hadn't remembered before, a small, glowing orb of light in her hand. In the dream, she raised the orb, and the Shadow Man recoiled, its form flickering. Katie woke up with a start, the memory of the dream vivid in her mind. She knew what she had to do. The next evening, she gathered her family in the living room. She explained her plan, telling them about the dream and the orb of light. They were skeptical, but agreed to try anything at this point. Katie stood in the center of the room, closing her eyes and focusing on the image of the orb. She imagined it growing brighter, filling her with warmth and strength. As she did, she felt a surge of energy, a lightness that contrasted sharply with the Shadow Man's oppressive presence. When she opened her eyes, the Shadow Man was there, standing in the corner. Katie took a deep breath, raising her hand as she had in the dream. She visualized the orb of light, willing it into existence. To her amazement, a faint glow appeared in her palm. The Shadow Man hissed, its form wavering. Katie stepped forward, holding the light out. "Leave us alone," she said, her voice steady. "You have no power here." The Shadow Man recoiled, its edges blurring. Katie continued to advance, the light growing stronger. The entity seemed to shrink, its form dissolving in the face of the light. For a moment, Katie thought she had won. But then, the Shadow Man surged forward, its darkness overwhelming the light. Katie felt a cold, crushing weight as the entity enveloped her. She heard its voice in her mind, mocking and sinister. "You cannot escape me. I am part of you." Katie fought back, summoning all her strength. The light in her hand flared, a brilliant burst that momentarily blinded her. When she could see again, the Shadow Man was gone. The house was silent, the air clear. Katie's family rushed to her side, their faces filled with relief and concern. "Did it work?" her mother asked, her voice trembling. Katie nodded, though she wasn't entirely sure. The Shadow Man was gone, but she couldn't shake the feeling that it was still out there, waiting. The investigator had warned that the entity might not be completely banished, and Katie knew she had to remain vigilant. In the days that followed, the house returned to normal. The disturbances ceased, and the oppressive atmosphere lifted. But Katie couldn't shake the feeling of unease. The Shadow Man might be gone, but its memory lingered, a dark shadow over their lives. Katie continued to research, determined to find a way to protect her family for good. She discovered that many who encountered shadow people believed they were drawn to certain individuals, feeding off their fear and negativity. Katie knew she had to remain strong, to keep the light within her burning bright. But as the days turned into weeks, she couldn't escape the feeling that the Shadow Man was still watching, waiting for a moment of weakness. The true horror, she realized, wasn't just in the encounters with the entity, but in the knowledge that it could return at any time. And so, the mystery deepened. The questions lingered. What was the true nature of the Shadow Man? Why was it attached to their family? As Katie stared into the night, she knew one thing for certain: this was just the beginning. The true horror was yet to come, and she would be ready. The end.
Thanks for tuning in to our podcast. If you enjoyed our exploration of ghosts, mythical creatures, and urban legends, please share it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe for more thrilling episodes. Until next time, my beloved listeners.